The first look. It all started with a glance. A moment so fleeting, it shouldn't have meant anything. But it did. It was a Friday afternoon. The kind where exhaustion seeps into your bones from a week of teaching too many classes and grading too many essays. The final bell had rung, and most of the students were long gone, spilling out of the halls and into their weekend lives. But not him. Not Aiden. I remember the sunlight filtering through the dusty classroom windows, casting a soft glow on the empty desks. Aiden stood at the back of the room, hovering near the door as if debating whether to leave. He wasn't just another student. He had this intensity, sharp, quiet, almost unsettling. He'd caught my attention from the start, though I never let myself dwell on why. "Miss Roberts," he called out, his voice pulling me out of my thoughts. "Could I stay behind for a moment? I have some questions about the assignment." "Of course," I replied, already gathering my things. It wasn't unusual for students to need extra help, especially the quieter ones like Aiden. But there was something different about him today. He didn't seem nervous or shy like most students who asked for help. He seemed in control. That thought alone should have sent alarm bells ringing in my mind, but I brushed it off. I was a teacher, he was a student. This was all perfectly normal. He approached my desk slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. I couldn't explain it, but there was something unnerving about the way he looked at me. It wasn't the typical look of confusion or curiosity that students had when asking for clarification. His gaze was something else. Something deeper, like he was seeing past the teacher, past the role and straight into me. I felt exposed, and it unnerved me. "I don't quite get the symbolism in The Great Gatsby," he said, placing his notebook on my desk. But his tone, the way he leaned a little too close, told me the symbols in Fitzgerald's book weren't what he was interested in. I smiled politely, ignoring the small knot forming in my stomach. "Sure, Aiden. Let's go over it again." We spent the next few minutes talking about Gatsby's obsession with the past, the unreachable dream, but all the while, I could feel the air shifting between us. It was subtle at first, the way he leaned in closer, the way his eyes followed me when I stood to explain something on the board. My throat tightened, and I found myself stumbling over simple words. What was I doing? This was absurd. He was my student. As I tried to focus, I caught sight of my reflection in the glass door. I looked tired, older than I felt inside. My husband, Greg, and I had been married for 10 years, comfortable, settled. He was a good man, kind and steady. But lately, there had been a growing void between us. We rarely talked anymore, except about work or mundane household chores. The fire we once had was long gone, replaced by a quiet routine that left me feeling more like a roommate than a wife. I shoved those thoughts away, focusing back on Aiden. But then, he said something that caught me completely off guard. "You're different, Miss Roberts," he said, his voice low. "You actually care. Most teachers, they just go through the motions, but not you. You see people." His words hit me like a blow. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, brushing it off with a laugh. "Well, it's my job to care, Aiden." He didn't laugh. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, eyes locked on mine, unblinking. "No, it's more than that. I think you see me." I froze. There it was, that intensity again. My skin prickled, and for a second I couldn't breathe. I needed to end this, to push away whatever weird tension was building between us. But before I could say anything, he leaned back and grabbed his bag, breaking the moment. "I'll work on the assignment. Thanks for the help," he said, his tone casual again, as if nothing had happened. But as he turned to leave, he hesitated. His hand brushed against mine, a touch so fleeting it could have been accidental. But it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. I watched him walk out, my heart racing. It was nothing, I told myself, just a student looking for attention. But as I drove home that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. I told myself it was nothing. After all, I was a professional. I had a life, a husband who loved me. But as the days passed, I found myself looking forward to those after-class moments more and more. And then came the day that changed everything. It was a week later. Aiden asked if we could meet after school again, this time for some extra help on an upcoming paper. I agreed, telling myself it was my duty to help my students succeed. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the real reason. I was drawn to him, to the way he looked at me, the way he made me feel noticed, alive. That afternoon, the school was nearly empty, the halls quiet except for the faint echoes of the janitor's mop bucket. I should have canceled. I should have told him I was busy, that I had a life outside these walls. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself waiting for him, heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. When Aiden arrived, he was different this time, more confident. He closed the door behind him, and the click of the lock echoed in the silence. I swallowed hard, my breath catching as he approached my desk. "Thanks for seeing me again, Miss Roberts," he said, his voice smooth. "I just can't seem to get this right without you." I forced a smile, my hands shaking slightly as I gathered the papers in front of me. "No problem, Aiden. Let's get started." But we didn't get very far. Within minutes, the conversation had shifted. Away from the paper, away from school. He started asking me questions, personal ones, about my life, my marriage, what I did when I wasn't at school. His voice was low, almost seductive, and I found myself answering without thinking. I talked about Greg, how distant we'd become, how lonely I sometimes felt, how teaching had become my entire world because it was the only place I still felt relevant. And then, Aiden said something that stopped me cold. "You deserve better, Miss Roberts." I stared at him, speechless. The room suddenly felt too small, too hot. "Aiden, we should stick to the assignment," I said, my voice shaky. But the look in his eyes made it clear. He wasn't interested in the assignment. And God help me, I wasn't sure I was either. He stood up, walking slowly around the desk until he was right in front of me. I should have stopped him. I should have told him to leave. But instead, I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering longer than they should have. "You don't have to keep pretending," he whispered. And in that moment, everything changed. Crossing the line. I don't remember how it started, only that I didn't stop it. Aiden's hand lingered near my face, and instead of pushing it away, I stayed still, frozen but not entirely unwilling. His fingers brushed against my skin, soft but deliberate, as though he was testing how far he could go. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the heat rising from somewhere deep inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. "You don't have to pretend," he repeated, his voice a low murmur that wrapped around me, seductive and dangerous. "Not with me." For a split second, sanity resurfaced. My brain screamed at me to stop this now, to push him away and remind him that I was his teacher, that this was wrong on so many levels. But another part of me, a darker, quieter part, wanted more. It had been so long since I felt seen, since anyone had looked at me the way he was looking at me now. Not as Miss Roberts, the teacher, or as Greg's wife, but as a woman. I craved it more than I cared to admit. His eyes locked onto mine, and the space between us disappeared in an instant. His lips hovered near mine, waiting for a signal, for some indication that I wouldn't pull away. I could feel the warmth of his breath, the closeness of his body, and my mind went completely blank. There was no classroom, no students, no Greg. It was just Aiden and the slow, unbearable tension between us. I should have stepped back. I should have walked away. But I didn't. I kissed him. The moment our lips touched, it was like a dam had broken. The electricity that had been building between us for weeks exploded. And suddenly, there was no going back. His hands were on me, firm but not rough, pulling me closer as my own body betrayed me, responding to him with a need I hadn't felt in years. Every rational thought, every sense of responsibility I had, dissolved in the heat of that kiss. I wanted this, more than I'd ever admit to anyone, more than I could admit to myself. We stumbled back toward the desk, his lips never leaving mine, and in that dizzying rush, all I could think about was how alive I felt. Every touch, every whispered breath sent shivers through me, igniting a fire I hadn't realized I still had inside. It wasn't just desire. It was rebellion. I was breaking the rules, the boundaries of my marriage, my career, everything. And in that moment, it felt intoxicating. Aiden, I whispered, trying to regain some control, but my voice sounded weak, breathless. He pulled away slightly, his eyes searching mine. We don't have to stop, he said, his voice husky with desire. I want this too. I want you. I closed my eyes, trying to find a reason to say no, to pull myself back from the edge. But all I could feel was how close he was, how my body was betraying me at every turn. His hands slid along my waist, slow and deliberate, sending sparks through every nerve. I can't, I started, my voice shaky, but even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to go back to the life I'd been living, dull, predictable, and suffocating. Aiden's lips found mine again, softer this time, coaxing me into surrender. And I did. With every kiss, every touch, the guilt that should have been weighing me down disappeared, replaced by the thrill of something forbidden, something exhilarating. This was reckless, dangerous, and entirely wrong. But in that moment, it felt like exactly what I needed. His hands were on me, exploring, as if he had been waiting for this as long as I had. My back pressed against the desk, the papers scattering beneath us, forgotten. I didn't care about anything except the way he made me feel. Alive, desired, wanted. More than I had felt in years. But then, just as quickly as it had begun, the reality of the situation crashed down on me like ice water. I pulled back, breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. We can't do this, I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. This is wrong. Aiden looked at me, his eyes still filled with that intense, burning desire. But there was something else there too. Something softer, almost vulnerable. I know, he said, his voice low, steady. But I don't care. I wanted to say that I cared. I wanted to tell him that this was insane, that we could both lose everything if we didn't stop. But the words wouldn't come. I just stood there, staring at him, my mind spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside the classroom, snapping me out of the haze. The janitor was making his rounds, and panic surged through me. We have to stop, I whispered urgently, pushing Aiden away gently, though it took every ounce of self-control I had. My breath came out in short, panicked bursts as I straightened my clothes, trying to pull myself together. What had I done? What had I almost done? Aiden stepped back, his eyes still locked on mine, but he nodded, understanding. This doesn't have to be the end, he said, his voice filled with certainty. We can figure this out. I shook my head, panic rising inside me. I couldn't figure anything out. I couldn't believe what I had just done. How close I had come to crossing a line I could never uncross. My hands trembled as I gathered the scattered papers, trying to focus on anything other than the way my body still ached for him. Aiden, please, just go, I whispered, my voice breaking. He hesitated for a moment, then slowly turned and walked toward the door. But before he left, he glanced back at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite read. This isn't over, he said quietly, and with that he was gone. I stood there alone, the room suddenly cold and empty. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing. What had I just done? What had I almost let happen? I knew I should feel guilty, ashamed. I had a husband waiting for me at home, a life I had built over the years. But as I stood there, all I could feel was a strange mixture of fear and excitement, an intoxicating blend of desire and dread. And worst of all, I couldn't stop thinking about the next time, the descent. The days after that kiss were an agonizing blur. I spent each moment trying to convince myself that it hadn't happened, that it had just been a lapse in judgment, a momentary mistake fueled by loneliness and weakness. But no matter how much I tried to push it to the back of my mind, Aiden lingered there, his touch still burning on my skin, his words echoing in my thoughts. Couldn't get him out of my head. Every time I walked into the classroom, my heart would race, anticipating his arrival. My mind was a battlefield of guilt and desire, The war between what I knew was right and what I so desperately wanted. Greg noticed something was off. He'd catch me staring off into space during dinner, or when we'd be watching TV in the evenings. He asked if I was okay, if work was stressing me out. I told him it was nothing, just the usual end-of-term pressure. He accepted it like he always did. Greg never pushed too hard. That was part of the problem. It wasn't long before Aiden tested the boundaries again. He started lingering after class more frequently, finding excuses to talk to me, about assignments, about books, about anything to keep us alone in the classroom. I tried to keep things professional, tried to maintain some semblance of control, but the tension was unbearable. Every glance, every passing touch felt like we were dancing closer to the edge, daring each other to jump. One afternoon, about a week after that first kiss, Aiden stayed behind as usual. The rest of the students had left, their chatter fading down the hallway, leaving the two of us in that familiar, dangerous silence. I was pretending to grade papers, my hand shaking as I held the pen. I could feel him watching me, and I hated that my body reacted to it. Hated that my skin prickled with awareness, that my heart sped up just knowing he was there. "Miss Roberts," he said, his voice smooth, almost playful. "Have you thought about what I said?" I didn't look up. "What you said? That it doesn't have to be the end." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. This was it. The moment I'd been dreading and craving, in equal measure. I could feel him moving closer, his presence a palpable force in the room. My mind screamed at me to stop this, to shut it down before things went too far. But my body had other plans. I was trembling, caught between fear and desire, my pulse thrumming in my ears. "Aiden, you have to understand." I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "This can't happen. I'm your teacher. This is wrong." "Wrong." He repeated the word like it was foreign to him. "Is it wrong to want something? To feel something? You can't pretend you don't feel it too." I finally looked up at him, and the intensity in his eyes nearly undid me. He wasn't a child. He wasn't the shy, uncertain student who needed my help. He was standing there, every ounce of his confidence daring me to deny what was happening between us. And God help me, I didn't know how much longer I could. "I'm married," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, like the words themselves were too fragile to survive the air between us. His gaze didn't waver. "But are you happy?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. Was I happy? No. The answer came so quickly it startled me. I hadn't been happy in so long that I'd forgotten what happiness even felt like. Greg was a good man, but our marriage had become a routine, predictable, monotonous, suffocating. I loved him, but I wasn't in love with him anymore. Somewhere along the way, we had drifted apart, and I wasn't sure we could ever find our way back. Aiden took a step closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch mine. His fingers were warm, and that simple contact sent shivers through me. "I see you, Miss Roberts," he whispered, his voice low, seductive. "I see how lonely you are. You don't have to be." I felt myself leaning toward him, like a moth drawn to the flame. Everything inside me was screaming to stop this, to walk away, to salvage what was left of my life. But I couldn't. I wanted him. I wanted to feel alive again, to feel desired in a way that I hadn't in years. His other hand reached up, tracing the side of my face, and I closed my eyes, leaning into the touch. "We shouldn't," I whispered, even though my body was already betraying me, responding to him with a hunger I didn't even recognize in myself. "But we will," he said, and before I could respond, his lips were on mine again, and this time I didn't resist. The kiss was harder, more intense than before, fueled by weeks of pent-up tension. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer as I sank into him, my mind clouded by the dizzying rush of it all. Felt dangerous, thrilling, and wrong all at once, but I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. We stumbled back toward the desk, papers scattering as he lifted me onto the edge. My body moved on instinct, wrapping around him as the kiss deepened, every touch igniting something primal inside me. There was no room for guilt, no space for thoughts of Greg or my career or the consequences. There was only Aiden and the heat between us, pulling me deeper into something I couldn't control. His lips trailed down my neck, leaving a trail of fire in their wake. My breath came out in ragged gasps as I clung to him, my mind spinning. This was madness. This was reckless. But it was also the most alive I'd felt in years. And I didn't want it to end. But then, a sudden noise, a knock at the door. My heart stopped, my entire body freezing in place as the cold, hard reality of what I was doing crashed down around me. I pushed Aiden away, scrambling off the desk, my hands shaking as I tried to fix my clothes. He stepped back, looking just as shaken, but there was a smirk playing on his lips, as though he found the whole situation amusing. The knock came again, louder this time, and I felt the panic rising in my chest. If someone saw us, if they knew, my career would be over. My marriage, my life, everything I had built would be ruined. I glanced at Aiden, who seemed unfazed, his eyes still locked on me with that same dangerous intensity. "Go," I hissed, barely able to form the words. He smirked, clearly enjoying the chaos he had created. "This isn't over," he whispered, his voice dripping with confidence, before slipping out the back door of the classroom just as I rushed to open the door. It was the janitor, holding a set of keys, his expression neutral as he glanced around the room. "Forgot to lock up," he said, oblivious to the storm that had just swept through my life. I nodded, my heart still pounding, sweat trickling down my spine as I forced a smile. "Thanks, I'll make sure it's locked." He left without another word, and I stood there, my legs trembling, my mind spinning. The weight of what I had done hit me like a tidal wave, and I sank into the chair behind my desk, burying my face in my hands. What was happening to me? What had I become? The guilt should have crushed me right then and there. But instead, all I could think about was Aiden. And the worst part? I wanted more. The spiral. The days after that moment in the classroom were a blur of emotions I couldn't fully control. I felt like I was living two lives. One where I was the devoted wife, the responsible teacher, keeping everything in place. And the other, a reckless version of myself, drawn into the vortex of something I couldn't explain but couldn't stop, either. Aiden hadn't backed off. If anything, he became bolder. His confidence was intoxicating. During class, he'd hold my gaze for just a second too long, his lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile that only I could interpret. I found myself craving those glances, those stolen moments of heat that left me breathless and trembling, even in front of a room full of students. Greg remained oblivious to the storm building inside me. He was the same, steady, dependable, boring. The man who went to bed early, kissed me goodnight without really looking at me, and then turned over, completely unaware that I was lying there, wide awake, drowning in guilt and desire. We barely touched anymore, and when we did, it felt mechanical, like an obligation rather than passion. But Aiden, when I was with him, everything came alive. He was a fire I hadn't realized I needed to feel again. A few weeks later, the dam finally broke. It was a Friday evening, just after school. The students had gone home, the halls quiet and empty as I packed up my things for the weekend. I told myself I wouldn't let it happen again. That the kiss, the touches, they were a mistake. I could still fix this. I could still walk away. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. And then, just as I was getting ready to leave, Aiden appeared at the door. "Miss Roberts," he said, his voice smooth as ever, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Got a minute?" I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the mixture of fear and excitement that had become almost routine now. "Aiden, you shouldn't be here," I said, trying to sound firm, but my voice came out shaky. "We can't keep doing this." His smile was lazy, confident. He didn't move. "Can't keep doing what?" he asked, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him, as if daring me to admit it. I swallowed hard, my heart racing as he came closer. "You know exactly what I mean. Whatever this is, it has to stop." But the words felt hollow even as I said them, because the truth was, I didn't want it to stop. Couldn't stop. Aiden had become a drug, and I was already far too deep in to pull myself out. You don't want it to stop, he said softly, his eyes locking onto mine, as if reading my thoughts. You're just afraid of what it means. I turned away from him, trying to create some distance between us. But I could feel him behind me, his presence magnetic, pulling me back toward him. Aiden, I'm your teacher. This is completely inappropriate, and it could ruin us both. Then why haven't you stopped it? He asked, his voice low, sending a shiver down my spine. You want this as much as I do. You're just afraid to admit it. I didn't answer because what could I say? He was right. I hated myself for it, but I wanted him. I wanted this. I wanted to feel the way I did when I was with him, alive, reckless, free. And even though I knew it was wrong, even though I knew it could destroy everything, I couldn't stop myself. I can't, I whispered, more to myself than to him. But then he was behind me, so close I could feel the heat of his body against mine. His hands slid around my waist, pulling me gently back against him, and my breath hitched. You can, he murmured into my ear, his voice low and intoxicating. And you will. His lips brushed my neck, sending a wave of heat through my entire body. I closed my eyes, letting the sensation wash over me, my resistance crumbling under the weight of his touch. My mind screamed at me to stop, to push him away, but my body, my traitorous, aching body, moved closer to him, responding to his every touch. We can't do this, I whispered, even though my body was betraying every word. But Aiden didn't stop. His hands slid under my blouse, his touch slow, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. You want this? He repeated, his breath hot against my skin. You can lie to yourself all you want, but you can't lie to me. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. The tension that had been building for weeks, the constant back and forth between right and wrong, shattered, leaving only the raw, uncontrollable need I had been trying so hard to suppress. I turned to face him, my lips crashing into his, and all the guilt, all the fear, dissolved in the heat of that kiss. My hands tangled in his hair as his lips moved against mine, hungry, desperate. This wasn't soft or tentative. It was a collision, a fiery explosion of everything we had been holding back. We stumbled back toward the desk, papers scattering once again as he lifted me onto the edge. My legs wrapped around him instinctively, pulling him closer, our bodies pressed together in a tangle of heat and desire. His hands were everywhere. My waist, my hips, my thighs. His touch sending sparks through every nerve, and I couldn't get enough. I was lost, completely, utterly lost in him. His lips trailed down my neck, and I gasped, my head falling back as he kissed the sensitive skin there. My hands gripped his shoulders, pulling him closer, deeper, until nothing existed outside of that room, outside of the fire raging between us. This was wrong. I knew it, but in that moment I didn't care. I didn't care about Greg or my job or the consequences that were sure to follow. I didn't care about anything except Aiden and the way he made me feel, alive, desired, free. The sound of my phone vibrating on the desk broke through the haze, startling us both. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as reality came crashing back down. Greg, my husband. I pushed Aiden away, breathless, my mind spinning. I can't, I whispered, panicking. I can't do this. He looked at me, his chest heaving, his expression a mixture of frustration and amusement. You already did, he said, his voice low, confident. I couldn't speak. My hands were trembling as I reached for my phone, staring at Greg's name on the screen. The guilt hit me like a freight train, crushing, suffocating. What was I doing? How had I let it get this far? I have to go, I said, my voice barely audible as I scrambled to straighten my clothes, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I have to go. But Aiden didn't stop me. He just stood there, watching me with that same infuriatingly calm expression. Like he knew this wasn't the end. Like he knew I'd come back to him. And maybe he was right. God help me, maybe he was right. I rushed out of the classroom, my heart pounding, my mind spinning with the weight of what I'd just done. My hands shook as I answered Greg's call. my voice forced and fake as I told him I'd be home soon, pretending everything was fine when nothing was fine. I drove home in a daze, the guilt gnawing at me like a parasite, consuming me from the inside out. How had I let it get this far? How had I become this person? Someone who betrayed the man she loved, who risked everything for a moment of forbidden desire. But even as the guilt tore me apart, even as I walked into my house, kissed Greg on the cheek, and pretended everything was normal, I couldn't stop thinking about Aiden. And that terrified me more than anything. The fallout. Everything started to unravel faster than I could control. After that night, nothing felt real. I went through the motions at home with Greg, pretending to be the same woman he'd known for a decade, but inside I was barely holding it together. Aiden's presence lingered in every corner of my mind. Every time Greg touched me, every time I looked at him across the dinner table, I felt sick with guilt. But it wasn't enough to stop me from thinking about Aiden, or from seeing him again. And of course, we didn't stop. It was reckless. We began meeting after school in secret. It started with a glance, then a touch, then hours spent locked in the classroom. The tension between us boiling over into stolen moments I couldn't pull myself away from. Aiden was a drug, and I was completely hooked. He had an energy I hadn't realized I was missing, and the thrill of what we were doing, the danger of it, only made it more intoxicating. But then things began to spiral out of control. One afternoon, when the school was empty and the halls were dark, Aiden and I had been in the classroom, lost in each other. I was on the edge of reason, knowing we were playing with fire, knowing how dangerous it had become, but unable to stop. His hands were on my body, my breath shallow, when I heard the door creak open. My heart dropped into my stomach. The janitor stood there, staring at us, frozen in shock. For a second, no one moved. It was like time itself had stopped, my entire world collapsing in on itself in slow motion. Aiden stepped back, but it was too late. We had been caught. There was no denying what had just happened. No pretending anymore. The janitor's face hardened as he quietly closed the door behind him, and I could feel the walls closing in. My mind raced. My heart pounded in my chest. But all I could do was stand there, paralyzed by the weight of what was about to happen. My entire life, the life I had built with Greg, my career, my reputation, was hanging by a thread, and I had just snapped it. "We're done," I whispered to Aiden, barely able to speak, my voice shaking with fear. "This is over. It has to be." He looked at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. For a second, I thought he might argue, that he might try to convince me otherwise, but instead, he nodded. "Fine," he said, his voice cold. "If that's what you want." He didn't wait for me to respond. He turned and walked out of the classroom without another word, leaving me standing there alone, trembling, my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. I didn't know what to do. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on me, suffocating. What if the janitor told someone? What if this got out? What if Greg found out? The guilt, the fear, the crushing panic all hit me at once, and I felt like I was drowning. I wanted to cry, to scream, to undo everything I had done, but it was too late. I had crossed the line, and there was no going back. That night, I went home to Greg, trying to act normal, trying to pretend everything was fine. But the moment I walked through the door, I knew something was wrong. Greg was sitting at the kitchen table, his face pale, his expression hard. My stomach twisted with dread. He didn't look at me when I walked in, just sat there, staring down at his phone. "Greg," I said, my voice trembling. "What's wrong?" He didn't answer at first. He just stared at the phone, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white from gripping the edge of the table. My heart pounded in my chest, the silence between us unbearable. Finally, he looked up, his eyes cold and filled with something I had never seen before: betrayal. "I know," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "I know about you and Aiden." The floor seemed to drop out from under me. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. All I could do was stare at him, my entire body frozen in shock, my mind spinning as I tried to comprehend what was happening. How do you know?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He held up his phone, and I saw the text messages. Messages between me and Aiden. Explicit, undeniable proof of what I had done. My entire body went cold. "I don't even know where to start," Greg said, his voice shaking with barely contained anger. "How could you do this? How could you throw away everything we've built for some kid?" "Greg, No," he snapped, slamming his fist on the table. "I don't want to hear your excuses. I don't care what you have to say. You've been lying to me. You've been sneaking around, doing God knows what, and now it's all blown up in your face." Tears filled my eyes, but I didn't know what to say. There was no excuse for what I had done. No explanation that could make it better. I had betrayed him, betrayed our marriage, and now it was all falling apart. "I thought we were happy," Greg said, his voice cracking with pain. "I thought we had something real, but I guess I was wrong. I never meant to hurt you," I whispered, choking back sobs. "I'm so sorry, Greg. I don't know what I was thinking." "Stop." He cut me off, his voice hard. "It's too late for apologies. It's over." I collapsed into a chair, my body trembling as the reality of it all hit me. My marriage was over. My career was hanging by a thread. I had ruined everything for something that wasn't even real, something that was just a desperate attempt to feel alive again. And now I had nothing. "I'm filing for divorce," Greg said, his voice cold, detached. "And I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you did. The school, the board, everyone. You're going to lose everything." I stared at him, my heart breaking, knowing he was right. There was no coming back from this. No fixing the mess I had made. I had destroyed everything, and now I was going to lose it all. Greg left that night, and I was left alone in the house we had built together, my mind reeling from the weight of what had just happened. The guilt, the shame, the regret. It all came crashing down, suffocating me, crushing me under the weight of my own choices. I lost my job. The school board found out, thanks to Greg's fury and the janitor's report. There was no room for forgiveness, no leniency. The scandal rocked the school, and I was forced to resign in disgrace. Aiden moved on. He graduated and disappeared from my life as quickly as he had entered it. For him, it was just a brief, exciting chapter, something he could leave behind. But for me, the consequences were permanent. I lost Greg. I lost my career. I lost the life I had spent years building, all because of a moment of weakness, a desperate need to feel something more. And now, all I'm left with is the empty silence of everything I destroyed.